The following video is one in a series on spiritual resilience training, a non-religious view of personal values and their dynamics with others. The contents reflect a variety of principles and practices of systems theory and relational counseling for team building and family resilience. Although the series is intended to support Army Corps values, each video also encourages the viewer to reflect on their current prominent values in specific situations and to consider what values may be more appropriate to means and results that are honorable and helpful with others. Chaplain Dillard initiates creating and posting these videos. Their contents and YouTube's linked videos do not necessarily reflect specific beliefs, practices, requirements, or endorsements of the Department of Defense, its subordinate organizations, or other groups with which Chaplain Dillard is affiliated.
Welcome back. Today we're going to look at a concept that's very philosophical and deep, but it's also extremely practical in developing your self-awareness and your management of yourself and leadership of others in helpful ways. And that is the concept and process of experiencing and expressing personal values or beliefs. Where do they come from? Why do we need to understand this? How do we use this in self-awareness and management and leadership? Hopefully all that will become clear. I want to take what I believe to be one of the most foundational and fundamental personal values of all, and that is intimacy with somebody else. And I don't mean physical intimacy, although that's one form, but emotional openness and connection. And even those are individual types of values and beliefs. What is our willingness and our ability to connect with somebody else so that we have so that they know who we are and we know who they are. We're committed to each other and we want to help each other move forward as individuals and in relationships, whether that's parent to child, spouses, best friends, supervisors, and close employees. There are still levels of intimacy because it involves trust, it involves understanding, it involves commitment, and all these are basic to any type of relationship. So let's take a look at first of all, the influences of how we decide on our degree of openness to intimacy as one example, and some of the things that affect it. Let's start with influence. First is our personality. And I say first because in a timeline we are born with certain leanings in our personality. We may be more outgoing or less outgoing, more inquisitive or more accepting, face value, more obstinate, which can be a positive or a negative thing. Any of you who have had more than one child or grew up with siblings know that we are born with certain leanings. And I have here that personality is an issue of high intimacy and high prevalence. What does that mean? Well, we are always with ourselves. We can't get away from the fact that we have personality and it's in us, and we have some innate desires in one direction or another for different reasons. Next, in a timeline, so to speak, is our family of origin. The parents you grew up with, your siblings, anybody else that lived with you in the house during those formative years, probably for the first 20 years. This is varying in intimacy and varying in prevalence. Families can live in the same house but not be very intimate. Meaning they don't necessarily talk to each other. They don't necessarily open up to each other and trust each other and commit to each other. They can be very transient. They can be emotionally distant to different degrees. And there's varying prevalence too. They're not always physically there, depending on the parents' jobs, depending on the culture. So this can have more or less effects on your willingness to be open to others. Depending on if you had positive or negative experiences, depending on what was modeled for you, what was rewarded, what was hindered and punished. Our individual experiences of tragedies or successes. In this particular example, we're talking about emotional intimacy with others. Did you try to open up and trust somebody and they shot you down? Which would have been a tragedy to you, especially if it was supposed to be from a caregiver, a parent, or a close sibling or a best friend. Did you open up to know somebody else and have them know you, and it became a wonderful relationship? that would be a success, and you would value intimacy more in the future if that was a pattern in your life. And then on top of that, we see cultural values and institutional training. What did your school teach you? If you grew up in the deep south of the Bible Belt, or the Northeast where life is faster, or the Midwest, or a foreign country, or you moved around, you got certain values. Some cultures value intimacy, as the example we're using in this particular video, more than others. Some value more distance as an expression of professionalism or self-control. What did your school's institutional training teach you, whether that's public school or homeschool or college or vocational school? Did they tell you that it's a good thing to be open to others, or did they tell you once bitten, twice shy? So all of these things are influences in whether we are open to, in this particular example, the value of intimacy or not. After these influences on a personal value, this example we're using is intimacy, we're going to make certain choices for or against, usually based on those influences. And there are different levels of for or against responses that we can make. Here's kind of in the green zone, and we'll see what this means. You can see here that I've labeled this as high return and low risk. Okay, I like the idea of being intimate with others, letting them know who I am, letting them get to know me, and me getting to know them, whether that's from the tolerance end, or yes, I prefer it, or somewhere in the middle of, hey, this is awesome. It's still pretty high return, pretty low risk. However, if we've not had positive experiences, it moves a little more to the left or the right, and then we have a moderate return and a moderate risk. I'd really rather ignore people who want to seek intimacy or downright avoid them. Or I may want to request more or actually pursue them in my behavior. This is a little less internal and more external. You begin to see this in relationships when it becomes more extreme to the left or the right. That's why I say there's a moderate return, because you don't get as much from the intimacy because you don't desire it as much, you don't see it as positive. Or we begin to pursue it, and others who have had different experiences may or may not want that. Again, we're using intimacy as one example here. Or it can move to a much greater extreme. And here we have a low return and a high risk. We may begin to refuse others who want intimacy, or even forbid it, impose our value on somebody else, and impose our belief on somebody. Or to the other side, we may demand it or force intimacy. And you can read between the lines of what that might look like. And again, that is because of our negative experiences, those negative influences that we've had. And intimacy can take many forms. It can take the form of wanting to control conversations, where we want to pry information out of others and really get to know them whether they want it or not, or reveal ourselves to them whether they want to know or not. Or it can take even more extremes, more extreme forms. But generally, extremes are almost always bad because they disrespect the other person's needs and desires in the situation and what's good for the relationship. Well, after influences and our choices, then oftentimes we move into creature comforts and how to deal with this because it's somewhat uncomfortable, and that would be our coping mechanisms. And we primarily have two different types of coping mechanisms. One is self-care, which is trying to increase our pleasure, and the other is other control, which is trying to minimize our pain. Let's take a look at some of these. Here you see that if we're kind of in the green or yellow zone, that the intensity and the number of coping mechanisms are relatively relatively low. That's why I have kind of the billowy cloud shape there. These things may be very culturally acceptable, but they're still coping mechanisms for self-care or other control. Somebody who likes to put in extra hours of work because it might give them a greater reputation of being dedicated. Somebody who wants to leave for work early and come back late because They want to spend more time of intimacy at work with people who appreciate them, or maybe they want to spend less time of intimacy with the people who are at home that they don't perceive want as much intimacy. A lot of it's based on perception, but it's also based in relationships and those other experiences that people had in their life. But these are kind of low intensity and low in number because they're in that green or that yellow zone. If it's a little more extreme, then the intensity and the number of self-care and other control become more moderate or greater in number. And you can see there that the shapes I've chosen have a little harder edge to them to show that they're a little more extreme, a little more difficult to handle. Because if we are going to ignore or avoid other people, or if we're going to request or pursue things that they may not want, intimacy as one example, we're going to have to up our game in self-care and other control. That could mean achieving a supervisory status so we have control over others' lives or over our own time management so that others can't tell us how to use our time. That could be becoming a real gym rat, going to work out and to get in good shape so that we can feel better about ourselves and hopefully draw people to us in intimacy because of the way we look or feel about ourselves. Those are still self-care and other control that may or may not be healthy, especially if they begin to control our lives or we use them to try to control others' lives. If we move to an even greater extreme, we see that the intensity and the number of self-care and other control mechanisms become higher intensity and higher in number. And it's all based on the fact that we have made extreme choices to refuse intimacy with others, or to forbid it, or to demand it, or to force it on others. I know that's a lot of information, but I hope that makes sense to you. It starts with our influences. What is our personality? How did our family of origin intensify that for good or bad? What were our individual experiences? What did our culture and our institutions say that kind of layered that on top of us and ingrained it in us? What choices have we made? Because we can make new choices, right? But we need to understand that we have made choices because of those influences. And then lastly, how are we trying to cope to make it manageable with self-care mechanisms or other control mechanisms? Remember, when we're self-aware, we can take a step back and look and say, wow, I didn't realize that I've been kind of on autopilot in these choices I'm making. My past is still controlling me. Do I want it to do that? Do I want to be just what my personality desires, even though sometimes it's self-destructive? Do I want to be what my family of origin said that I always was, or what I was never going to be or had to be? Do I want to make my own choices? What about my cultural values and those individual experiences of tragedy and success? Are those going to rule me and define me, or am I going to make new choices based on what is most helpful to my current relationships? Self-awareness is key to making intentional decisions for management of others and leadership in ways that bless that relationship. Hope that's helpful to you. Might want to watch it again. See you next time.
At the release date of this video, I am stationed with Research Development and Engineering Command, RDECOM, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Because the majority of our personnel are in this area, I spend most of my time here. I do, however, travel to our distant units based on command priorities and budget. I place these videos on YouTube for broad visibility to Army personnel and their families, but I hope the videos will be helpful to others too. If you are assigned to RDECOM and want to request specific topics by video, training on site or by VTC, or confidential counseling on site or by secure webcam, you can contact me at jeffrey.d.dillard.mil@mail.mil.